modern human, same body, same brain, same eyes, was alive 200,000 years ago. If they walked past you today in jeans and a hoodie, you'd never suspect they came from the Stone Age. But here's the strange part. For roughly 150,000 years, they did almost nothing human. No cave paintings, no music, no religion, no myths, just survival. Then, suddenly, around 50,000 years ago, humanity bursts into creativity. Art, symbols, seafaring, storytelling. What changed? Why the silence? And why did it break so suddenly? Chapter 1. Why did humans suddenly become human? For nearly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens, modern humans, looked like us, thought like us, and had the same brains as us. But for the first 150,000 of those years, there was almost no sign of what we now call culture. No art on cave walls, no musical instruments, no buried graves with rituals, no jewelry or myths. Just survival, stone tools, fire, hunting, and gathering. Then suddenly, about 50,000 years ago, a wave of creativity swept across the human world. People began painting deep inside caves, crafting ornaments, creating symbolic language, and even sailing to unseen islands. It looked like a cultural explosion. For decades, scientists asked, what changed? Why the long silence? And why did it break so suddenly? Early theories suggested that some genetic mutation flipped a switch in the human brain. The FOXP2 gene, linked to speech and language, was seen as the likely trigger. The idea was that this gene rewired our minds, sparking imagination and communication. But this theory collapsed when researchers discovered that Neanderthals carried the same version of FOXP2. If our close cousins had it too, then it couldn't explain why culture seemed to take off only in Homo sapiens. At the same time, archaeologists began finding signs that cultural behavior had much older roots. In South Africa's Blombos Cave, researchers discovered 100,000-year-old ochre pieces engraved with crosshatch patterns, and nearby, shell beads with holes, likely worn as jewelry. At Pinnacle Point, early humans used fire to refine stone tools and harvested shellfish, showing advanced planning. These weren't just acts of survival. They were evidence of symbolism, of meaning, of people thinking ahead. Some of these artifacts dated back 164,000 years, more than 3 times older than the supposed cultural explosion. What we once thought was a sudden revolution was actually a long, slow buildup. So why did the 50,000-year marker become so famous? In part, because of where we were looking. Most early archaeology happened in Europe, and that's also where Homo sapiens arrived around 50,000 years ago. That's when we first saw cave paintings in France, figurines in Germany, and complex tools. But those discoveries represented culture arriving in Europe, not starting there. The real beginnings had occurred much earlier, likely in Africa, but they were overlooked due to a Western-centered view of history. It's like discovering a musician at their first hit single and assuming that's when they learned to play, when in reality, they'd been performing in basements for years. Even more humbling is the fact that Homo sapiens were never alone. We shared the earth with other human species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, and others. Far from being primitive brutes, these relatives showed signs of intelligence and culture. Neanderthals crafted complex tools, controlled fire, and may have used black powder, manganese dioxide, to ignite wood, a form of basic chemistry. They buried their dead as early as 65,000 years ago, possibly with flowers. In Spain, they painted caves tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived. In France's Bruniquel cave, they built ring-shaped structures out of broken stalagmites 176,000 years ago, deep in the pitch dark. These weren't random acts. They were planned, deliberate, and possibly symbolic. Denisovans, a lesser-known branch of humanity, lived in Central Asia and left behind a green chlorite bracelet, carefully drilled and polished, dated to around 40,000 years ago. Homo erectus, who lived as far back as 2 million years ago, engraved patterns into shells 500,000 years ago, perhaps the earliest symbolic art ever found. These weren't almost humans. They were thinking, experimenting, expressing. So if multiple human species had brains capable of meaning, why didn't culture catch fire earlier? The key may lie not in intelligence, but in numbers. For most of early human history, populations were extremely small, just a few thousand individuals scattered across vast regions. When groups are that small and isolated, cultural knowledge is fragile. If one skilled person dies before passing on their knowledge, it disappears. This is called cultural drift, the slow erosion of ideas over time. Language, tools, traditions, they all vanish if they're not shared and sustained. But around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, things shifted. Populations grew, climate stabilized. Human groups began to cluster near coasts and rivers. These new communities allowed ideas to spread, survive, and evolve. Trade, intermarriage, and migration created networks that protected culture from disappearing. Symbolism, storytelling, and art didn't emerge because our brains changed. They emerged because our connections did. The fire of culture needed kindling, and now enough people were finally in the room to keep it alive. The classic view of evolution as a ladder, with Homo sapiens at the top, is outdated. Evolution is a branching tree, with many paths and dead ends. Neanderthals and Denisovans weren't failed experiments. They were fully adapted to their environments, and even left genetic traces in us. If the climate had stayed different, or if Homo sapiens hadn't migrated, they might still be here today. What happened 50,000 years ago wasn't a revolution. It was the moment humanity had enough people, stability, and memory to preserve ideas. We didn't invent humanity. We inherited it from a family of thinkers, builders, wanderers. We're just the branch that made it through. Chapter 2. We were never alone, and never the only thinkers for most of our time on Earth. Homo sapiens weren't the only humans. We lived alongside cousins, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo naledi, and the tiny but capable Homo floresiensis. These weren't mere evolutionary side notes. They were intelligent, adaptive beings with their own tools, behaviors, and very likely, cultures. Yet for over a century, we painted them as primitive dead ends, stocky cave dwellers or simple scavengers. But that image is dissolving fast. Today's research paints a richer picture, one where we weren't the first to wonder or create, just the ones who lasted. Take Neanderthals, for example. Once dismissed as grunting brutes, they are now known to have made tools tailored to different uses, controlled fire, and even used manganese dioxide to ignite it more efficiently. They buried their dead in deliberate pits, sometimes possibly with flowers. In caves like La Pasiega in Spain, they made red pigment markings over 64,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens entered Europe. In Bruniquel cave in France, they constructed ring-shaped structures using broken stalagmites, 176,000 years ago, 300 meters deep into the darkness. This wasn't random instinct. It was planning, coordination, and maybe even ritual. Further east, the Denisovans, a mysterious sister species, left behind fragments of a young girl's finger bone in a Siberian cave. Her DNA showed they weren't Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. They were something else. Their legacy lives on in modern Melanesian and Australian Aboriginal populations, who carry up to 4% Denisovan DNA. These weren't passive cave dwellers. In the same cave layer, archaeologists found a polished green chlorite bracelet with a carefully drilled hole, perhaps the oldest known fine jewelry. Not made by Homo sapiens, but by a different kind of human with equally capable hands and minds. Even Homo erectus, who appeared nearly 2 million years ago, wasn't just surviving, they were innovating. In Java, a 500,000-year-old shell shows a deliberate zigzag engraving, symbolic, abstract, and intentional. It's the oldest known sign of design in our lineage. And Homo naledi, found in South Africa's Rising Star cave system, had brains the size of oranges but showed signs of burying their dead in remote chambers over 200,000 years ago. Small-brained, but not simple. Then there was Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, just 3 feet tall, living on an isolated Indonesian island. Despite their size and limited brain volume, they likely hunted animals, used tools, and adapted to a complex island ecosystem. All these humans, in different times and places, were exploring versions of the same question: how to live, how to survive, how to leave a mark. Our story isn't separate from theirs, it's entangled. We shared time, space, even genes. Many of us today carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Those from Oceania carry an additional 5% Denisovan DNA. These aren't historical footnotes. They're part of us, literally. So why did Homo sapiens survive while the others didn't? It wasn't superior intelligence or divine spark. It was numbers, networks, and luck. A shift in climate, a volcanic eruption, or a drought could have wiped us out. In fact, it nearly did. Genetic evidence shows our population may have dropped below 10,000 individuals around 70,000 years ago, possibly due to the Toba supervolcano eruption. We weren't inevitable. We were fragile, but we endured. What we call humanity today is a product not of one lineage, but many. Our success wasn't the result of brilliance alone. It was the result of connection, endurance, and memory. We passed stories. We built on each other's knowledge, and we were lucky enough to be in the right places at the right times. The rest of the human family wasn't less evolved. They just didn't make it through. So when we gaze at ancient cave art or wear symbolic jewelry or wonder about the universe, we're not acting alone. We're echoing the same questions our ancestors asked, some with big brains, others with small ones, but all capable of meaning. Humanity wasn't invented 50,000 years ago. It was assembled layer by layer, thought by thought, across species, across continents, across millennia. We're not the summit of evolution. We're a surviving branch of a tree full of explorers. And maybe the real story isn't what made us special, but how many versions of being human once walked this earth. Chapter 3. We were never alone. So if Homo sapiens weren't alone, and if other human species shared our capacity for meaning and creativity, then what truly set us apart? The answer, it seems, lies not in the sudden appearance of brilliance, but in the slow accumulation of connection. Around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, something shifted, not inside our brains, but around us. Populations began to grow. Climate conditions stabilized just enough to allow larger, more permanent settlements. Humans started clustering near rivers, coastlines, and resource-rich zones where survival was easier, and groups could stay together longer. With more people came more interaction. Ideas could now travel from one mind to another without being lost. Innovations that once died in isolation began to echo, evolve, and spread. A new spear design didn't vanish with its inventor. It was taught, copied, improved. Songs became traditions. Symbols became stories. Burial practices turned into rituals. This process, what researchers call cumulative culture, wasn't about one person having a great idea. It was about many people keeping that idea alive across generations. It was scale that changed everything. More humans meant more opportunities to observe, imitate, question, and build. This is what transformed scattered sparks into a wildfire of culture. And with that fire came myths, music, religion, trade, navigation, and the seeds of civilizations. But none of this was guaranteed. Culture isn't a permanent achievement. It's a fragile structure built on memory, language, and connection. When those bonds break, knowledge fades. We see this today in endangered languages, disappearing traditions, and forgotten histories. Even in the ancient world, cultural drift could erase entire innovations if communities were too small or too disconnected. So the story of humanity's rise isn't the story of a singular awakening. It's the story of enough people, in enough places, sharing enough memory to carry meaning forward. That's what truly made us human. Not the spark itself, but the network that kept the spark alive. And that network, fragile as it was, changed everything. It allowed art to stretch beyond a cave wall, allowed myths to outlive generations, allowed ideas to move faster than people. It turned intelligence into legacy. Connection didn't just help us survive, it helped us remember who we are. Chapter 4. The Power of People, Not Just Brains. What emerges from this long, tangled story of human origins isn't a tale of triumph, but one of continuity and humility. For so long, we've pictured evolution as a ladder, each rung taking us higher, more advanced, more intelligent, more civilized, until modern humans finally stood at the top. But evolution doesn't build ladders. It grows trees, twisting, branching, overlapping paths, some that flourished, others that withered away. Homo sapiens aren't the final form of intelligence, just one surviving branch on a vast and messy tree of life. Neanderthals weren't failures. They were brilliantly adapted to Ice Age Europe. Denisovans weren't missing links. They were explorers of the high-altitude ranges of Asia, passing on genetic traits that still help modern Tibetans thrive. Even smaller-brained species like Homo naledi or Homo floresiensis developed complex behaviors we're only beginning to understand. Their stories didn't end because they were inferior. They ended because the world changed, and they didn't adapt fast enough, or perhaps simply because of chance. We tend to look back and imagine we were always destined to win, as if nature was working toward us all along. But survival isn't destiny. It's resilience, adaptability, timing, and often pure luck. Genetic evidence shows we too nearly vanished. At least once our population dropped to perhaps fewer than 10,000 individuals. One volcanic eruption, one long drought away from disappearing. The miracle isn't that we're special, it's that we made it. And what we carry with us isn't just our own legacy, but the echoes of many kinds of humans who dreamed, explored, and imagined in their own ways. Their DNA is inside us. Their creativity influenced us. Their failures taught us. Humanity didn't begin when Homo sapiens painted their first cave. It began when minds of any kind started to ask questions, tell stories, make meaning. And that thread runs deeper, wider, and older than we used to think. We are not the chosen. We are the inheritors. And the greatest truth of all may be this: being human has never been about standing alone at the top of the tree. It has always been about remembering that we are part of it.